In the last lecture, I suggested that the two primary kinds of sentences aren't really two different kinds at all, but represent the opposite ends of a continuum of degrees of suspense. In other words, instead of saying all sentences are either loose or periodic, it's actually more useful and more accurate to think of all sentences as making different demands on the reader's concentration and patience. Some sentences delivering the goods of their messages as quickly as possible, others dragging out the process, finding any number of ways to delay the completion of the sentence. Well, I cheerfully admit to taking more than a little delight in finding pressure points where traditional grammatical definitions, explanations, and classifications, long passed down to us as the received wisdom of writing, where they don't seem to work as advertised, where received wisdom, in fact, turns out to be a lot of hooey, I don't want to take too much pleasure in doing so. I don't want to be mistaken for the grammatical or rhetorical-oriented version of the Star Trek continuity buffs who gloat when they point out that Scotty was holding his drink in his left hand just before the Klingon attack, but aha, the drink is in his right hand the very next shot. My interest in exploding rigid definitions and categories is in redirecting our attention to things that matter. Far too much thinking in traditional texts devoted to writing is obsessed with identifying or classifying language structures without ever wondering what those structures actually do, how they work. For example, I can point to dozens of grammar and writing texts that identify adversative conjunctions such as but or however or nevertheless, but I don't know of any discussions in writing books that consider the conceptual implications when a reader is given information that seems to be headed toward one destination, only to be undercut or reversed, its initial information effectively erased and replaced by information that is quite different, if not antithetical, to the original propositional content of the sentence. For example, that puts together the propositions in both. Most grammar and writing texts are much more interested, in John Steinbeck's terms, in spine counting than in exploring relational realities. Yet it is precisely the relational reality between writer and reader that determines effective prose. And one of my goals in this course has been to question, whenever possible, the utility of pure categories of sentences. As Richard Lanham reminds us, prose styles rarely come in pure forms, purity being usually a tacit assumption to ignore complications for the sake of analysis. One of the things that most fascinates me about suspensive syntax is that it can be achieved in so many different ways that any attempt to create rigid or pure categories of suspensive sentences would be a hopeless waste of time. There are as many ways to suspend or delay the completion of a sentence's message as there are ways of putting off something we don't want to do. And in this sense of finding new reasons to delay what we don't want to do, we procrastinators are the most innovative and imaginative folks around. Fortunately, suspensive syntax gives us the opportunity to turn a vice into a virtue, as delay in a sentence can be a very good thing. Accordingly, in this lecture, I want to survey some of the resting points along the continuum of suspense along which all sentences fall. This survey will be somewhat haphazard, as many of these sentences defy categorization, having in common only their discovery of a way to delay the end of the sentence or to provide the end with some sort of surprise. My goal here is to free suspensive syntax from the long-standing assumption that periodic sentences, while marks of the writer's control and sophistication, are usually, if not inevitably, long and difficult to follow. Remember H.J. Rose's description of the periodic sentence as the long and frequently involved type of sentence needing skill to handle it properly, in which the construction begun with the first word is not completed until the last. Powerfully suspensive sentences do not have to be all that long or all that complicated, but they do need skillful handling, and they generally are most effective when consciously planned. Short suspensive sentences are all around us. It's not just a job, it's an adventure. It's not just footwear, it's equipment. Read my lips, no new taxes. I was, perhaps, stalling. I came, I saw, I conquered. Where she comes from, it turns out, is Arkansas. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. Or this from Anthony Bourdain in his Cook's Tour, Cambodia is a dream come true for international losers. And somewhat longer suspensive sentences are also bountiful. Excuse me while I wipe the tears of laughter from my eyes and put a small but powerful handgun to my temple. And while we're on the subject of guns, notice the almost perverse turn taken by this sentence from William Kittredge in his book, Who Owns the West? Quote, after half a mile in soft rain on the slick hayfield stubble, I would crouch behind the levee and listen to the gentle clatter of the water birds and surprise them into flight, maybe a half dozen mallard hens and 3 green-headed drakes lifting in silhouetted loveliness against the November twilight, hanging only yards from the end of my shotgun. End of quote. Two somewhat opposite patterns frequently found in mid-length suspensive sentences are the post-colonic drumbeat of a final word to which the sentence has been building, and the completely unexpected appearance at the end of the sentence of a word or phrase no one could have predicted. A classic New York Times article about political consultant Mark Penn illustrates the first of these patterns. He remained for the second Clinton term and through Mr. Clinton's impeachment trial, demonstrating, among other things, one of the virtues that the Clintons prized most, loyalty. And the opposite pattern can be seen in a sentence from William C. Martin's essay on the inimitable Reverend Ike. Quote, Reverend Ike has come a long way, honey. End of quote. That honey comes out of nowhere, dresses like a homeless person, bless her soul. And Gordon Parks gives us yet another variation on this pattern of slightly unsettling ending words or phrases when he tells us in an essay on Duke Ellington, Edward Kennedy Ellington counted on going to heaven, have no doubt. And we need to remember that the surprise at the end of a sentence that has been seemingly building to some dramatic conclusion may simply be anticlimactic, as we see in this sentence from Annie Dillard. Late one night, while all this had been going on, and while the library was dark and locked as it had been all summer, and I had accustomed myself to the eeriness of it, I left my carol to cross the darkness and get a drink of water. Alexander Theroux managed to find a way to make a sentence featuring the Marquis de Sade end with a whimper rather than with a bang when he wrote, the notorious Marquis de Sade, ruminating on the subject of man's greatest torment, perversely concluded that it was the impossibility of offending nature. Suspensive sentences lend themselves to cataloging as a means of delaying the completion of the sentence, and cataloging seems to lend itself to kicking off autobiographies, as we see in the celebrated first sentence of The Education of Henry Adams. Under the shadow of Boston State House, turning its back on the house of John Hancock, the little passage called Hancock Avenue runs, or ran, from Beacon Street, skirting the State House grounds, to Mount Vernon Street on the summit of Beacon Hill, and there, In the third house, below Mount Vernon Place, February 16, 1838, a child was born and christened later by his uncle, the minister of the First Church, after the tenets of Boston Unitarianism, as Henry Brooks Adams. By the time Adams gets around to announcing his own birth, he's located his home in an enviable and eminently historical section of Boston, touched several geographical bases with iconic names, and identified not only his religion, but also revealed that his uncle was a Unitarian minister. Talk about your auspicious beginnings. Now, Leonard Woolf struck a very different tone in opening his autobiography, but like Adams, he chose a highly suspensive sentence with which to begin his story. Looking back at the age of 88 over the 57 years of my political work in England, knowing what I aimed at and the results, meditating on the history of Britain and the world since 1914, I see clearly that I achieved practically nothing. And Christopher Hitchens singles out a wonderfully suspensive sentence by another famous writer to explain how he had chronicled his own life. Quote, in his 1991 memoirs, Kingsley Amis stated roundly, I have already written an account of myself in 20 or more volumes, most of them called novels. The point of these examples is that suspensive sentences do indeed align themselves along a continuum that runs from the very unsurprising to the very surprising, from the anticlimactic to the climactic. Suspensives can seem rambling, continuously digressing through interruption after interruption, parenthetical comment after parenthetical comment, finally reminding us of Mark Twain's celebrated story in Roughing It of the old ram, a story that never really starts and certainly never ends. Or suspensives may just sound incredibly fussy, exacting, determined to get things exactly right before proceeding to the end of the sentence, a quality famously associated with Henry James's later style. It's also interesting to note that suspensive syntax sometimes requires more than a single sentence to create its effect. The critical discourse concerning periodic sentences notes that periodic style can be distributed across several sentences as long as delay or suspense is the goal, and the completion of the point of the period is suspended to the very end of the sequence of sentences it covers. We can see this in a two-sentence combination from Art Buchwald in an essay about acid indigestion. Buchwald writes, America is an abundant land that seems to have more of everything than anybody else. And he adds, and if one were to ask what we have the most of, the answer would be acid indigestion. In the same collection of essays on great American things, M.F.K. Fisher opens her essay on apple pie with a similar two-sentence 1-2 punch. It is as meaningless to say that something is as American as apple pie as it is to assert proudly that a Swedish or Irish grandfather who immigrated to Minnesota was a first American. Both the pie and the parent sprang from other cultures, and neither got here before the Indian. And Edwin Newman also utilizes this two-sentence suspensive pattern to powerful effect in his essay on viable solutions. The day is not far off when someone about to join his family will excuse himself by saying that he does not want to keep his microcluster of structured role expectations waiting. True, I came upon this gem of social scientific jargon in London, but that only shows how far our influence has spread and how determined the British are to join the Americans at the kill when the English language finally is done to death. And the Motiebos and Toron make clouds come fast in shadows moving over wheat, and the small, careful stepping horses, the smell of olive oil, the feel of leather, rope-soled shoes, the loops of twisted garlics, earthen pots, saddlebags carried across the shoulder, wineskins, the pitchforks made of natural wood, the tines were branches, the early morning smells, the cold mountain nights and long hot days of summer, with always trees and shade under the trees, then you would have a little of Navarra. But it's not in this book. That first humongous and almost unreadable suspensive sentence from the acclaimed master of short sentences weighs in with no fewer than 272 words, all of which really just set up that short second punch, but it's not in this book. A variation on the 1-2 punch suspensive combo is simply to create a cascade of suspensive sentences, each building on the previous sentence, creating an atmosphere or climate in which delay and parenthetical digressions seem to become a kind of natural order of things, as Gene Stafford illustrates in an essay on Coca-Cola. At one time, there was a widely held belief among edgy mothers that Coca-Cola derived its name from cocaine, which was one of its principal ingredients. In the vernacular of the South and the West, it was referred to as dope, and that it was habit-forming. The pause that refreshes could lead quicker than you might think to the big sleep. My own mother had it on good authority, never mind who told me, that an aspirin tablet pulverized and added to a glass of Coca-Cola produced the same effect as a Mickey Finn. Under the influence of this witch's brew, many unwitting girls had been despoiled, stripped was the way my mother put it, by concupiscent mountebanks posing as Fuller Brushmen. Suspensive syntax can delay our perception of the nature of the sentence as well as delaying our perception of the sentence's propositional content, as when the final step taken by the sentence reveals that it is asking a question. Renaissance scholar and clergyman Richard Hooker, a frequently cited master of suspensive syntax, provides a memorable example of this strategy in his 1593 work of the Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Concerning faith, the principal object whereof is that eternal verity which hath discovered the treasures of hidden wisdom in Christ. Concerning hope, the highest object whereof is that everlasting goodness which in Christ doth quicken the dead. Concerning charity, the final object whereof is that incomprehensible beauty which shineth in the countenance of Christ the Son of the living God. Concerning these virtues, the first of which, beginning here with a weak apprehension of things not seen, endeth with the intuitive vision of God in the world to come. The second, beginning here with a trembling expectation of things far removed and as yet but only heard of, endeth with real and actual fruition of that which no tongue can express. The third, beginning here with a weak inclination of the heart towards him unto whom we are not able to approach, endeth with endless union, the mystery whereof is higher than the reach of the thoughts of men. Concerning that faith, hope, and charity, without which there can be no salvation, was there ever any mention made saving only that in law which God himself hath from heaven revealed? A couple of somewhat less antique examples of this pattern of turning the suspended sentence into a question at the very last moment might read, as I watched in horror the news clips of protesting students, the government called them rioters and hooligans, defiantly but hopelessly standing their ground against line after line of advancing soldiers, faces hidden by visors, their interlocked plastic shields reminding me of the battle tactics of Roman legions, I could only silently murmur again and again, "What have we done?" Here's another. Although I am perhaps overly fond of footnotes, although I tend to weigh the value of authority not by the rigor of argument as much as by the writer's pedigree and the prestige of her publisher, does this make me a pedant? In the same way that I earlier wondered what the affective impact is of a sentence that reverses course after an adversative conjunction, I wonder about the conceptual impact of a sentence that delays not only perception of the propositional goods it delivers, but also suspends realization until the end of the sentence that it will ask a question rather than make a statement. In the preceding examples, we've seen that suspense comes in more shades than a certain ice cream chain has flavors. And we've seen that suspense created by syntactical delaying strategies can be put to many uses. Winston Weathers and Otis Winchester, in their well-respected, rhetorically grounded writing text, The Strategy of Style, suggest three main reasons for employing suspensive syntax. Number one, for varying your predominantly loose style and emphasizing your more important ideas. Number two, for putting the important ideas at the end of the sentence. And number three, for sustaining interest in a long sentence. Richard Landon shifts focus from the purposes of using suspensive style to its primary rhetorical strategies in the service of delay, identifying them as suspension over a number of complex statements, parallelism of phrases and clauses, balance, climax, and what Landon terms virtuoso display. Joan Didion touches all of these bases in her essay, Some Dreamers of the Golden Dream, with her suspensive account of a perplexing murder investigation. They set out to find it in accountants' ledgers and double indemnity clauses and motel registers. Set out to determine what might move a woman who believed in all the promises of the middle class, a woman who had been chairman of the Heart Fund and who always knew a reasonable little dressmaker and who had come out of the bleak wild of prairie fundamentalism to find what she imagined to be the good life. What should drive such a woman to sit on a street called Bella Vista and look out her new picture window into the empty California sun and calculate how to burn her husband alive in a Volkswagen? To these suggestions of characteristic purpose and rhetorical strategies, we should probably add a brief summary of the broad moves involved in creating suspensive syntax. If the sentence suspends completion of its message, whether by delaying its main clause until the very end, by splitting the subject from the verb with qualifying material, or by using any construction that refines, sharpens, or adds to initial information before putting it to final use, it has been historically termed a periodic sentence. But I think it more accurate to refer to it as a suspensive sentence. To be a complete stylist, to be able to display the syntactic versatility of the accomplished writer, to be able to control the rhythm of the sentence's delivery of information or shaping of affective impact, writers must have at their command each of the basic sentence patterns. That the periodic/suspensive sentence reverses most of the qualities of most cumulative sentences, that it seems to suggest a greater degree of control, architectonic mastery over the material it presents, that it almost always requires quite a few words before its rhythm is clear, and that it almost always slows the reader down should be fairly obvious. What is not so obvious is the fact that when used effectively, the periodic suspensive sentence can actually generate interest combining conceptual complexity with syntactic suspense. On the other hand, as Professor Karl Klaus has playfully noted, if you're a no-nonsense person, if you're a straightforward writer and you expect the same of others, if you don't have any patience with long-winded people, that is, who never come directly to the point, but instead waste your time in seemingly endless digressions as if they were mentally incapable of putting first things first, then you will probably consider periodic sentences, such as the one you are reading right now, which looks like it may never come to an end, to be an exasperating waste of time. As we'll explore in much greater detail in the next lecture, various delaying tactics mark the periodic suspensive sentence, giving it a suspenseful quality, a sense of its constituent parts being juggled or scrambled until the very last moment, the shot at the buzzer finally falling into place at the very end of the sentence, resolved by the verb or modifier that allows us to process the information that has come before. Four broad tactics prevail, two of them relying on modifiers to delay completion of the base clause, the other two using initial clauses or phrases either as modifiers or as extended subjects. Here's the first pattern. An inverted cumulative works periodically, forestalling the base clause by a number of modifying levels, keeping the distinctive cumulative rhythm, but putting it to suspensive effect. Now, forestalling the base clause by a number of modifying levels, keeping the distinctive cumulative rhythm, but putting it to suspensive effect, an inverted cumulative works periodically. Secondly, completion of the base clause can also be delayed, interposing, modifying, or qualifying material between the subject and the verb of the sentence, a splitting tactic that runs the risk of losing or alienating the reader, easily the least controlled or focused of the periodic pattern of the periodic form. Third pattern. Initial qualifying constructions lead to more complicated periodic structures, presenting information that becomes complete, safe to accept as final, only when joined with or reassessed in light of information in the base clause, a process signaled by opening words such as although, even, or if. And fourth pattern, an extended subject produces similar results, initially offering an infinitive or relative clause, then bringing the sentence into focus only when it becomes clear that what at first may have looked like a complete sentence is actually no more than the subject of a much, much longer sentence, as I've done with the sentence I've quoted before from The Great Gatsby, designing my sentence to end on the same climactic word as did Fitzgerald's. Even when the East excited me most, even when I was most keenly aware of its superiority to the bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond the Ohio with their interminable inquisitions, which spared only the children and the very old, even then it had always for me a quality of distortion, was Fitzgerald's way of suspending his message to the very end of his sentence, a tantalizing way of foregrounding a word that functions on two levels, reminding us first of Nick's ambivalence toward the world around him, then handing us on a rhetorical silver platter the one word that most accurately also characterizes Nick's own narration: distortion. I'm proud of that sentence. In fact, it may be the best sentence I've ever written. That it is suspensive rather than cumulative both amazes and delights me. Experiment with suspensive syntax, and I bet you'll generate sentences you will find incredibly satisfying and of which you will be equally proud.